There is something different about being heard by someone who cannot see you. The visual information is gone. The costume, the lighting, the movement, the expression, all of it removed. What remains is only the sound, only the voice and what lives inside it. Ray Charles could not see Tom Jones. He had been blind since he was 7 years old, when glaucoma took his sight, in a period before any treatment could prevent it. In the decades since, he had built a life and a career entirely around what he could hear. His ears had become something extraordinary as a result. Not supernatural, nothing mystical about it, but trained to a degree of precision that most people with full sight never need to develop. He could hear things in music that sighted musicians missed. Not because blindness grants gifts, but because necessity creates its own kind of discipline. When your entire experience of a performer is sonic, you learn to listen at a depth that most people never reach. In 1969, Ray Charles appeared on This Is Tom Jones. The set was warm. The studio audience was small. The cameras were positioned as they always were, to capture what looked impressive. Ray Charles sat at the piano, his dark glasses on, his hands resting on the keys, his head slightly tilted in the direction of sound, the habitual orientation of someone whose ears have learned to work like eyes. Tom Jones was already on set when Ray Charles arrived. They had met briefly before, not closely, but enough to carry a mutual awareness of each other's reputation. What neither of them expected was what the afternoon would teach them about the other. The "This is Tom Jones" format placed its guests in comfortable proximity. Not across a desk, not separated by a formal barrier. Close, in the way that musicians are close when they are making music together rather than performing at each other. That proximity mattered with Ray Charles, because Ray Charles's way of knowing another musician was not visual. It was entirely a matter of distance and sound. The closer he was, the more he could hear. The more he could hear, the more accurately he could assess. That afternoon, the distance between Ray Charles and Tom Jones was small. And Ray Charles's ears were, after 50 years, among the most calibrated listening instruments in the music industry. What he heard that afternoon, he would not forget. During the recording, Tom Jones sang. Not at performance level immediately. He moved into it gradually, the way a voice warms from the edge toward the center. First quietly, then with more, then with the full quality that the room had been arranged to receive. Ray Charles played. His hands on the piano found the complement to what Tom Jones's voice was doing. Not leading it, not following it, moving alongside it in the way of someone who has heard the shape of a voice and knows where it wants to go. There is a particular quality to being accompanied by someone who genuinely hears you. It is different from being accompanied by someone very skilled, who is nonetheless primarily listening to themselves. Tom Jones felt the difference immediately. He sang differently when Ray Charles was at the piano. Not better in the technical sense, differently. More honestly, perhaps, because the accompaniment told him that the truth of the sound was being received, not just the performance of the sound. At one point, in the middle of a long phrase, Tom Jones's voice did something unrehearsed. It dropped slightly, not out of control, not a fault, an instinct. The voice going somewhere it hadn't been planned to go, following an impulse that came from the music rather than from the arrangement. Ray Charles's left hand followed it, without hesitation, without a discussion, without anyone in the room knowing the adjustment was coming. The hand simply found where the voice had gone and joined it there. The musicians in the room glanced at each other. Something had happened that most of them had not witnessed before. Not a mistake caught, not an improvisation managed. A genuine response. One musician hearing another and moving toward them without planning. That is a rare thing in a professional recording environment. Professional environments are built around plans, around arrangements that have been decided in advance and executed as agreed. What had just happened was outside the agreement. It was two musicians in the same room at the same moment, hearing the same thing. After the session, Ray Charles said something to one of the musicians near him. He was not speaking to the room. He was speaking to the person beside him. But the room was quiet enough that several people heard it. He said, "That voice has been somewhere. You can hear where it's been." He was not referring to the Welsh mining valleys of Tom Jones's childhood. He had no specific information about that. He was referring to what the voice contained, the particular weight of a voice that has been shaped by something more than training, something that comes from a life rather than a method. You can hear where it's been. He said it simply, as a statement of fact from someone who had been listening for 60 years and had developed a calibration for this distinction that was, by 1969, beyond argument. Tom Jones was standing close enough to hear it. He said nothing immediately. There was nothing useful to say. When someone with the ears of Ray Charles makes an observation about your voice, the appropriate response is not language. The appropriate response is to keep singing, and to understand that something has been seen in you, not with eyes, but with something more penetrating, and that you have a responsibility to that understanding. By 1969, Ray Charles had been making music for nearly 20 years. He had started performing in the late 1940s, playing in small clubs in Florida and Georgia, learning the musical vocabulary of jazz, blues, and gospel by absorbing everything within earshot. He had no visual model to copy. He had only the sound of what came before him. That constraint became a philosophy. Ray Charles approached music the way a very precise craftsman approaches raw material. He heard what was actually in a voice rather than what was projected around it. He stripped away the presentation and listened to the substance. He had heard a great many voices in this way. He had played with musicians at every level of the craft. He had sat beside greatness and beside mediocrity, and developed a calibration for the difference that was, by 1969, almost involuntary. He was 58 years old. He had survived addiction, legal trouble, and periods of professional difficulty that would have ended other careers. He was still here, still playing, still recording, still listening with that particular precision that the years had only refined. Tom Jones, at 29, was a different kind of musician, at a completely different stage of his life and career. He had been performing professionally for only 5 years. He had reached a level of success that most performers never approach. But he was still young enough to be surprised by his own instrument, still discovering what the voice could do under different conditions and in different company. He had been told many things about his voice, that it was powerful, that it was unusual, that it had a quality difficult to categorize. He had not yet been told what Ray Charles was about to tell him, because Ray Charles had not yet heard him in a room small enough to hear what was true. A large concert hall has a way of elevating every voice. The reverb, the distance, the acoustic compression of a large space. These things make many voices sound impressive. They are useful for performance. They are not useful for assessment. A television studio, by contrast, is intimate. The sound is close. The room is dry. What you hear is what is actually there, without the architecture of a large venue adding something the voice didn't bring. The television studio was small enough. And Ray Charles was paying attention in the way that only someone who has learned to navigate the world entirely through sound can pay attention. Not casually, not politely, with the full weight of 50 years of listening. Before the cameras rolled, the musicians in the room warmed up. Tom Jones moved through a few phrases of a song he had been rehearsing. Nothing formal, just the casual exercise of a voice finding its morning quality. Ray Charles, sitting at the piano 20 feet away, stopped what he was doing. His hands left the keys. His head turned slightly. Not toward Tom Jones's face. He could not see Tom Jones's face. Toward the sound. He said nothing. He simply listened. The room noticed. Not all of it, but the musicians nearest to Ray Charles noticed. Because when Ray Charles stopped to listen to something, the thing being listened to was usually worth knowing about. Tom Jones heard that sentence. He didn't respond to it in the moment. There was no obvious response to make to someone like Ray Charles saying something like that. No adequate language for it. No useful acknowledgement that wouldn't somehow diminish the observation by performing a reaction to it. So he said nothing, and he carried it instead. In the years that followed, Tom Jones spoke about Ray Charles with a specific reverence that was different from the way he spoke about other performers he admired. He said, "When you played with Ray, you understood what music actually was. Not what you'd been taught it was, what it actually was." That distinction between what music is taught to be and what it actually is was one that Ray Charles had spent his career embodying. He had started with the conventions of jazz and gospel and blues and had systematically exceeded all of them, combining musical traditions that were not supposed to be combined and finding that the combination revealed something more true than any of the traditions alone. He had been called the genius, not as flattery, as description. But his genius was not separate from his ears. It was the product of his ears, of 50 years of hearing music without the distraction of its visual presentation, of knowing a voice purely by what it contained rather than how it appeared. The music industry of the 1960s was very good at understanding voices in terms of what they looked like. Tom Jones had a look that the industry understood well. The physicality, the stage presence, the particular magnetism that cameras responded to. Ray Charles could not assess any of that. He could only assess the voice. And what he heard in Tom Jones's voice on that set in 1969 was not the performance of a charismatic entertainer. It was a voice that carried a life. That distinction, the difference between a voice that is performing a feeling and a voice that has been shaped by an actual life, was the most important musical distinction Ray Charles knew how to make. He made it very rarely. He made it that afternoon. Ray Charles died in 2004. He left behind a discography that covered more ground than most musicians attempt across several lifetimes. He left behind a reputation for musical honesty that has remained intact through every shift in taste and format. He also left behind a scattered set of things he had said about music, not in formal interviews, not in prepared statements, but in the moments between takes and rehearsals when someone was close enough to hear. That voice has been somewhere. You can hear where it's been. That sentence, said in a quiet room to no one in particular, is one of the more precise things ever said about what makes a voice worth hearing. It is also one of the more precise things ever said about Tom Jones. Not about his career, not about his image, not about the residencies or the television show or the records. About the voice itself, about where it had come from, about what it carried from that origin to every room it entered afterward, about the specific relationship between a childhood in a Welsh valley and the particular color of a voice that grew up there, a color that no amount of training or commercial success could alter, because it was not something added to the voice, it was the voice itself. About why, when Ray Charles stopped what he was doing and turned his head toward a sound across a studio, the musicians in the room understood that something worth paying attention to was happening. There is something different about being heard by someone who cannot see you. Ray Charles heard Tom Jones in 1969. Not the image, not the career, not the television program or the Las Vegas residency or the hit records. Just the voice. And what he heard in just the voice was enough to stop what he was doing, turn toward the sound, and say something true out loud in a room full of people who suddenly understood why it needed to be said.